I need you to picture this. It is a rainy Tuesday afternoon in London. I am standing in the middle of a Tesco Express, staring at a loaf of bread, and I am literally on the verge of tears. Not because I am homesick, but because for the first time in my 20-something years of existence, I have read the ingredient list on a standard, run-of-the-mill, cheap loaf of grocery store sandwich bread, and I recognize every single word: flour, water, yeast, salt, maybe a little bit of ascorbic acid. That is it. I was literally shocked. I just stood there in the aisle, people brushing past me with their little shopping baskets, and my whole American reality completely shattered because I realized right then and there, holding this 90 pence loaf of bread, that my entire life back in the States, I had been completely lied to about what food actually is. And sorry, USA, but Europeans have better food, and I am not just talking about fancy Michelin star restaurants in Paris or truffles in Italy. I am talking about the boring, everyday basic food that normal people eat on a Tuesday. I am talking about the bread, the butter, the eggs, the cheese, the snacks. I have been living in the UK for almost 2 years now, and the physical, psychological, and historical differences between how we eat in America and how they eat over here are so profoundly massive that we need to talk about this. But actually, I want to completely switch gears for a second and talk about eggs. Yes, eggs. Because if you want to understand the foundational, almost philosophical difference between American food and European food, you have to look at the humble chicken egg. In the US, we would never ever dream of buying eggs off a normal room temperature shelf. If you walk into a Kroger or a Walmart or a Target in America, the eggs are in the massive, brightly lit refrigerated dairy aisle, shivering behind glass doors. You take them home, you put them immediately into your fridge, and if you leave them out on the counter for a day, you throw them away because you are terrified of getting salmonella. So, when I first moved here to the UK and I walked into a Sainsbury's, I spent 10 minutes wandering the refrigerated section looking for eggs. I couldn't find them. I finally asked an employee, and he pointed me toward the baking aisle. The baking aisle. Sitting right there next to the flour and the sugar on a normal unrefrigerated shelf were hundreds of cartons of eggs. I was literally shocked. I thought, are these people insane? Are they trying to poison the entire population? Here's the truth, and the science behind this is absolutely fascinating. In America, industrial farming practices are so intensely packed and structurally unsanitary that the risk of salmonella on the outside of the egg is incredibly high. So, the USDA mandates that all commercially sold eggs must be power washed with chemicals, usually a chlorine rinse, before they are packed. But here is the catch. When you chemically wash an egg, you strip away something called the bloom or the cuticle. This is a natural, invisible protective coating that the chicken puts on the egg as it's being laid, which seals the thousands of microscopic pores on the eggshell and stops bacteria from getting inside. Because the US washes that protective layer off, the egg becomes completely porous and vulnerable. It literally has no defense mechanism left. Therefore, it absolutely must be refrigerated to keep bacteria from multiplying and getting inside the egg. It is a completely reactive solution. We create a problem by stripping the natural defense, and then we fix it with refrigeration. Now look at Europe, and specifically the UK. In the UK, it is actually illegal to wash Class A eggs. Illegal. They believe that washing the egg fundamentally damages its natural integrity. So how do they stop salmonella? They use a proactive approach instead of a reactive one. Back in the late 1990s, the UK had a massive salmonella crisis. It was huge, it was all over the news, ministers were resigning, it was a whole political scandal. But instead of deciding to just bleach the eggs, the British agricultural authorities decided to fix the actual root of the problem, the chickens. They initiated a massive, nationwide, heavily regulated program to vaccinate the flocks against salmonella. They improved the living conditions and they vaccinated the birds. Today, the Lion Mark, which is this little red stamp you see on almost every single egg sold in the UK, guarantees that the egg came from a flock vaccinated against salmonella. Because the chicken is healthy, the egg is healthy. Because the egg isn't washed in chlorine, the natural protective cuticle is still perfectly intact. Because the cuticle is intact, bacteria can't get in. And because bacteria can't get in, you don't need to refrigerate it. It is entirely safe on the counter. When I learnt this, my mind was blown. Because it perfectly encapsulates the entire difference between the American food system and the European food system. The American system is built on chemical intervention to fix symptoms. The European system is built on structural regulation to protect the source. And that brings me to the legal frameworks, which is where things get truly, deeply terrifying. We need to talk about the FDA versus the EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority. If you want to know why American food makes you feel sluggish, bloated, and terrible, you have to look at the underlying philosophy of the law. In the US, the FDA operates on a principle that is essentially innocent until proven guilty. A food additive, a chemical, a preservative, or a synthetic dye is generally allowed to be put into our food supply until there is absolute, undeniable, overwhelming scientific consensus that it is actively harming people. And even then, it takes decades of lawsuits to get it removed. Furthermore, there is a massive legal loophole in the US called GRAS, which stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. This loophole allows food manufacturers to basically self-regulate. A corporation can invent a new chemical preservative, hire their own scientists to do a completely biased study, declare the chemical generally recognized as safe, and start pumping it into our cereal and our bread without ever formally showing the safety data to the FDA for pre-approval. It is the Wild West. It is late-stage capitalism manifested in our digestive tracts. But over here in the UK and across Europe, the regulatory bodies operate on something called the precautionary principle. This is a completely inverted philosophy. The precautionary principle states that if a chemical or an additive might cause harm to human health, even if the science isn't 100% perfectly settled yet, the government will ban it or restrict it as a precaution. The burden of proof is on the corporation to prove that the chemical is unequivocally safe before it ever touches a consumer's lips. The corporation has to prove safety, the consumer doesn't have to prove harm. But I know what you're thinking. I know exactly what my American friends back home are screaming at their screens right now. Olivia, British food is bland. What about the baked beans on toast? What about the jellied eels? We have barbecue. We have Tex-Mex. We have deep dish pizza. And listen, I hear you. The stereotype that British food is terrible is one of the most pervasive myths in the world, and I absolutely believed it before I moved here. I thought I was going to be living on boiled potatoes and unseasoned mush for the rest of my life. But we need to talk about the historical context of where that stereotype actually comes from, because it is entirely rooted in trauma. British food wasn't always considered bad. In fact, prior to the 20th century, British cuisine was rich, diverse, and heavily spiced. They had an empire that spanned the globe, meaning they had access to incredible spices from India, sugar from the Caribbean, and diverse cooking techniques. But then came World War II. The UK was an island nation under massive naval blockade by German U-boats. They simply could not import food. So in 1940, the British government introduced rationing, and I am not talking about a brief period of inconvenience. Rationing in the UK lasted for 14 solid years. It didn't even end when the war ended in 1945. It continued all the way until 1954. That is an entire generation of people who grew up never seeing a lemon, never having olive oil, having strictly limited amounts of butter, meat, and sugar. The culinary culture was literally starved to death. People had to learn how to survive by boiling whatever root vegetables they could grow in their backyard. The focus shifted entirely from flavor and enjoyment to pure, unadulterated caloric survival. So yes, the food in the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s in Britain was famously austere and bland because an entire generation had forgotten how to cook for pleasure, and the global supply chains took decades to recover. That is when American soldiers stationed in the UK went home and told everyone that British food was garbage. But here is the truth. That was 70 years ago. The UK today, especially cities like London, Manchester, and Edinburgh, has undergone a massive culinary renaissance. The quality of the ingredients here is so vastly superior to the average American ingredient that you don't need to cover everything in a gallon of ranch dressing to make it palatable. The butter here is rich and yellow because the cows actually graze on green grass. The dairy is unadulterated. The meat is strictly regulated, with incredibly high animal welfare standards compared to the US. They don't pump their cows full of RABST growth hormones, which by the way is completely banned in the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. but totally fine in your American glass of milk. Over here, and even more so in countries like France and Italy, eating is an experience. It is a fundamental right to human dignity. Even in the UK, which is arguably the most fast-paced, work-centric country in Europe, there is a totally different reverence for the lunch break. And this brings me to a deeply beautiful British cultural institution, the meal deal. If you are an American, you probably don't know what the meal deal is. Let me explain. You walk into any supermarket, a Tesco, a Sainsbury's, a Boots pharmacy, and for about £3.50, which is like $4, you get a main, a snack, and a drink. The mains are fresh, high-quality sandwiches on decent bread with real cheese and actual roast chicken, or pasta salads. The snacks can be a bag of crisps or fresh fruit, or a boiled egg. The drink can be a smoothie, an iced coffee, or a sparkling water for $4. You grab your meal deal and you go sit in the park. On any given sunny day in London, at 1 p.m., every single patch of green grass in the city is completely covered with office workers sitting down, away from their desks, eating a fresh meal deal, and actually talking to their co-workers. They are not eating for fuel, they are taking a designated pause in their day to exist as human beings. And that brings me to the absolute wildest part of this whole thing, the cost. Here's the truth. In the US, eating healthy is an extreme luxury. It is a class signifier. If you want to eat food without petroleum dyes, without high fructose corn syrup, and without chemical preservatives, you have to go to Whole Foods or a specialized farmer's market. You have to pay $8 for a loaf of organic bread. You have to pay $7 for a carton of pasture-raised eggs. The American food system is designed so that the ultra-processed, chemically laden, subsidized garbage is incredibly cheap, and real, actual food is incredibly expensive. It is a system that literally prices the working class out of basic health. When I moved to the UK, I was bracing myself for my grocery bill. London is famously an expensive city to live in. The rent is high, the transportation is high, so I assumed the food would bankrupt me. I went to Aldi for my first big grocery haul. I bought fresh vegetables, beautiful cuts of meat, amazing unpasteurized cheeses, thick cut bacon that wasn't injected with water, fresh bakery bread, milk, eggs, everything. I piled it onto the conveyor belt, bracing myself for a $150 bill. The cashier scanned everything, looked at me, and said, "That'll be £32, please." I literally asked her if she forgot to scan half my cart. She looked at me like I was insane. Food in the UK, specifically high-quality grocery food, is so unbelievably affordable compared to the US, and this isn't an accident. This is the result of intense market competition between massive supermarket chains like Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, Morrisons, Aldi, and Lidl. They are locked in a perpetual price war for basic staples. But it is also because the baseline standard of food is so heavily regulated by the government that the cheap food is still real food. You don't have to go to a specialized luxury supermarket to get a loaf of bread without high fructose corn syrup, because high fructose corn syrup isn't allowed to be the baseline in the first place. The poorest person shopping at the cheapest supermarket in the UK is eating food with cleaner ingredients, fewer chemicals, and better safety profiles than an upper middle class American shopping at a standard Kroger. Think about how insane that is. Let's talk about the physical effects, the bodily reality of making this switch. Before I moved here, I struggled constantly with what I call the American bloat. If you live in the US, you probably know exactly what I am talking about. It's that heavy, sluggish, distended feeling you get in your stomach every afternoon. I thought I had irritable bowel syndrome. I thought I had a gluten intolerance. I thought I had a dairy sensitivity. I was constantly taking antacids, trying different elimination diets, buying expensive probiotics. I genuinely thought my body was just broken. Then I moved to the UK. Within 3 weeks, the bloat was completely gone. I didn't change my diet at all. In fact, I was eating more bread, more butter, and more cheese than I ever had in my entire life, because I was so excited by how good everything tasted. I was eating massive croissants from the local bakery. I was eating giant wedges of Somerset Brie. I was eating fish and chips, and yet my stomach was completely flat. My digestion was perfect, and my energy levels were completely stable. I wasn't crashing at 3 p.m. every day. Why did this happen? It wasn't magic. It wasn't just because I was walking more, although the walkable infrastructure of European cities is a huge factor in public health compared to the car-dependent suburban sprawl of the US. But walking doesn't cure a chemical intolerance. The reality is, I never had a gluten intolerance. I had an American wheat intolerance. In the United States, commercial wheat is often sprayed with a chemical called glyphosate right before it is harvested. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in the weed killer Roundup. Farmers spray it on the wheat as a desiccant to dry the crop out quickly and evenly so it can be harvested faster. This means that the chemical residue of weed killer is baked directly into American flour. Furthermore, American commercial bread uses an additive called potassium bromate to strengthen the dough and make it rise higher. Potassium bromate is classified as a category 2B, possible human carcinogen. It is banned in the UK. It is banned in the European Union. It is banned in Canada. It is banned in China. It is banned in Brazil. But it is perfectly legal and widely used in the United States. So when I was in the US eating a turkey sandwich on whole wheat bread, I thought I was being healthy. But my body was actually trying to process heavy doses of sugar, weed killer residue, and a known carcinogenic dough conditioner. No wonder my immune system was constantly inflamed. No wonder I was bloated. When I switched to UK bread, which legally cannot contain potassium bromate, which is made from wheat that is strictly monitored for pesticide residue, and which is leavened primarily with actual yeast and thyme rather than a cocktail of chemical accelerators, my body finally relaxed. It recognized the substance as actual food, digested it properly, and extracted the nutrients without going into an inflammatory defense mode. And the dairy. Oh my God, the dairy. In the US, I avoided milk because it gave me terrible acne and stomach cramps. Again, I thought I was lactose intolerant, but in the US, conventional dairy cows are pushed to their absolute biological limits. They are fed unnatural diets of corn and soy instead of grass, which alters the fatty acid profile of their milk, massively increasing the omega-6 inflammatory fats and reducing the healthy omega-3s. Because they are kept in concentrated animal feeding operations, they are prone to mastitis, an udder infection. So what does the industry do? They pump the cows full of antibiotics. They also use the synthetic growth hormones I mentioned earlier to force the cows to produce unnatural quantities of milk. That American glass of milk is essentially an inflammatory cocktail of stress hormones and antibiotics. Over here, I drink whole milk in my tea every single day. I eat massive blocks of cheddar cheese, and I have absolutely zero issues, zero, because the cows are generally pasture-raised, grazing on actual grass, which naturally balances the omega-3 profile of the milk. The use of preventative antibiotics is massively restricted by law, and artificial growth hormones are completely illegal. The milk is just milk. It's not an industrial byproduct. I think the hardest part about realizing all of this isn't just the anger. And believe me, there is a lot of anger. When you realize that the American government and massive food lobbying groups have essentially traded the physical health and well-being of the American population for corporate profit margins, it makes you furious. It makes you realize why the US has such astronomical rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune diseases, and colon cancer in young adults compared to peer nations. We are being poisoned for profit, and we are being told that it is our own fault because we don't have enough self-control or we aren't exercising enough. But beneath the anger, there is this profound sadness. I am sad for my family back home. I am sad for my friends who are struggling with gut issues and mental fog, thinking they just need to try the latest expensive fad diet, when really, they just need to live in a country where the food supply isn't actively working against them. I am sad that the baseline experience of eating a simple, affordable, delicious, nourishing meal without fear of chemical contamination is considered an impossible luxury in the wealthiest country on earth. Living in the UK has completely rewritten my relationship with food. I don't look at calories anymore. I don't track my macros on an app. I don't have a list of forbidden foods in my head. Because when you strip away the high fructose corn syrup, the petroleum dyes, the preservatives, and the inflammatory oils, food stops being the enemy. It becomes what it was always supposed to be: nourishment, connection, culture, pleasure. So yes, sorry America, you can have your massive drive-thrus, you can have your 24-hour megamarts, and you can have your neon blue sports drinks. But the Europeans absolutely unequivocally have better food. And it has nothing to do with fancy recipes or elite culinary skills. It is entirely about a fundamental societal respect for the raw ingredients, a legal system that protects the citizen over the corporation, and an understanding that what we put into our bodies actually matters. The next time you find yourself eating a sandwich at your desk in 5 minutes while staring at a spreadsheet, just remember the people sitting in the park with their meal deals, eating real bread, and living an entirely different, far more delicious reality.